It's the last night the walls will ever stand, and you're standing inside them. You're in Ravenna, the marshy capital where the Western emperors have hidden for decades, safer here than in Rome itself. It's the 4th of September, 476. Outside the palace, a general you've never trusted is waiting with an army that no longer answers to you. Inside, a 16-year-old boy sits on the throne that made him emperor before he was old enough to shave. His name is almost a joke history hasn't finished telling yet. Romulus, like the founder of Rome; Augustulus, a diminutive that means little Augustus. By morning, the western half of the Roman Empire will have no emperor at all, not deposed and replaced, just gone, ended, and almost nobody watching that sunrise understood they were witnessing the last page of a 1,000-year story. You have to go back a little further to understand how a teenager ended up holding an empire that was already dead in every way but name. By the 470s, the Western Roman Empire is a shell of what it once was. Rome itself hasn't been the political capital for a century. Real power sits in Ravenna, protected by swamps and walls, run not by emperors, but by the generals standing behind them. Some of those generals are Roman by blood, many are not. The Western army is now largely made up of what Roman writers called foederati, allied barbarian soldiers, Germanic and Gothic warriors who fight for Rome because Rome pays them, not because they believe in it. Where does an empire go when the men holding its swords no longer share its identity? You're about to find out. This didn't happen overnight. 66 years earlier, in 410, the Visigothic king Alaric had done something no enemy had managed in 8 centuries. He sacked Rome itself. The city survived, but the shock never fully faded. Then in 455, the Vandal king Gyseric sailed from North Africa and sacked Rome a second time, stripping it of treasures that had sat untouched since the days of the Republic. Between those two disasters, a string of generals learned a lesson that would define the empire's final decades. Whoever controlled the army controlled the throne, and the man wearing the purple robe was often just the army's chosen mouthpiece. A general named Ricimer spent nearly 2 decades installing and discarding emperors like Orestes, would later try to do himself, sometimes propping up a candidate for a year or two before deciding he preferred someone else. By the time Julius Nepos took the throne in 474, backed by the Eastern court in Constantinople, the Western Empire had already cycled through 9 emperors in 20 years. Do you start to see the pattern? A throne that changes hands that quickly isn't really a throne anymore. It's a chair being fought over. The man who puts Romulus Augustulus on the throne is his own father, a general named Orestes. Orestes has an interesting history himself. He once served as secretary to Attila the Hun, the man who terrorized the Roman world a generation earlier. After Attila's empire collapsed, Orestes drifted back into Roman service and climbed the ranks of the Western army until in 475 he did something bold. He turned against the sitting emperor, a man named Julius Nepos, and drove him out of Italy. Nepos fled to Dalmatia, across the Adriatic, and kept calling himself emperor from exile. Orestes didn't crown himself in his place. He crowned his teenage son instead. Why put a child on a throne you could take yourself? Because a child is easier to control. Because a puppet needs no more legitimacy than the man holding the strings. Orestes intended to rule Italy through his son while doing the actual governing himself. It should have worked. It didn't. The army that made Orestes powerful was that same mix of Germanic foederati, and they had a demand. For years, soldiers serving Rome in Gaul and elsewhere had been given 1/3 of the land they defended as payment, a practice called hospitalitas. The troops in Italy now wanted the same arrangement. 1/3 of Italian land, for the men holding Italy together. It was not a small ask, and it was not without precedent. Orestes said no. Maybe he thought it beneath Roman dignity to carve up Italian soil for foreign soldiers. Maybe he simply couldn't afford to say yes without alienating the old Roman landowning class he still needed. Whatever the reason, his refusal was the mistake that ended him. One of his own officers stepped forward to lead the army in revolt. His name was Odoacer, a soldier of mixed Germanic background, likely Syrian, who had served in the same ranks as the men now furious at Orestes. Odoacer promised them exactly what Orestes had refused: land permanently. In exchange for loyalty, the army chose him on the spot. Within weeks, in August of 476, Odoacer's forces caught up with Orestes at Piacenza and killed him. Orestes' brother was executed too. The puppet emperor's protector was gone, and the boy in Ravenna had nobody left standing between him and the man who had just killed his father. Do you think a 16-year-old, alone in a palace, fully understood what was coming for him? Odoacer marched on Ravenna. The city that had sheltered emperors for generations offered no real resistance. And here is where the story does something almost nobody expects from the fall of an empire. Odoacer did not have Romulus Augustulus executed. He did not imprison him for decades the way rival claimants so often did to each other. According to the Byzantine chronicler Malchus of Philadelphia, whose account survives in fragments used by later historians, Odoacer took pity on the boy's youth and beauty and simply deposed him. He granted him a pension of 6,000 solidi a year and sent him to live out his life at a villa in Campania, near Naples, previously owned by a Roman aristocrat named Lucullus. The last Roman emperor of the West wasn't beheaded on a battlefield or paraded in chains. He was pensioned off to a seaside estate, and as far as the historical record shows, simply disappears from it. No death date, no further mention in any surviving source. He may have lived for years, he may have lived for decades. Nobody wrote it down because by then nobody in power needed him to matter anymore. Odoacer didn't stop at removing the boy. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the robes, the symbols of Western imperial authority to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. The message was simple and in its own way radical. Odoacer wasn't claiming to be emperor of the West. He was declaring that the West didn't need one anymore. He would rule Italy as a king under Zeno's nominal authority, and the office of Western emperor, the position that had once been held by Augustus and Constantine, would simply cease to exist. Zeno, for his part, was in an awkward position. Julius Nepos, the emperor Orestes had chased out in 475, was still alive in Dalmatia, still legally the Western emperor by Zeno's own recognition, and still writing letters asking for support. Zeno told Odoacer that if he truly respected Roman authority, he should restore Nepos. Odoacer never did. Nepos was murdered in 480, still clinging to a title that, by then, corresponded to nothing at all. So which date really marks the end of Rome? Historians have argued about this for a very long time, and the honest answer is that no single year does it cleanly. The eastern half of the empire, centered on Constantinople, didn't fall in 476. It kept going, calling itself Roman, for nearly another 1,000 years, until Constantinople itself fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Structurally, Roman institutions in the West had been hollowing out for decades before Romulus Augustulus ever took the throne. In many ways, 476 is a symbolic marker more than a true rupture. But symbols matter. The 18th century historian Edward Gibbon, in his monumental work on Rome's decline, used precisely this moment to anchor the end of an era that had shaped law, language, architecture, and government across an entire continent. The deposition of a teenage puppet emperor became, in the memory of later centuries, the line separating antiquity from what came after. Here's the twist that makes this story stranger than it first appears. Romulus Augustulus carries the names of both the beginning and the end. Romulus, the legendary founder who is said to have built Rome from nothing in the 8th century BC. Augustus, the first man to formally hold the title of emperor, who began the very office this boy would be the last to occupy. History rarely hands you a coincidence this clean. A child bearing the founder's name and the first emperor's title, quietly closing the door on everything both of those names had built. Whether you read that as fate or simple accident, it's hard not to feel the weight of it. In Constantinople, Zeno had his own headaches to manage besides an unwanted crown from Italy. He was midway through a reign interrupted twice by rival claimants to his own eastern throne, and the last thing he needed was a war over a Western title that, in practical terms, no longer commanded any army worth the name. Accepting Odoacer's arrangement cost Zeno nothing and settled an inconvenient question quietly. It would take more than half a century before another Eastern emperor, Justinian, tried to physically reclaim Italy and the rest of the old Western provinces by force, launching a brutal series of campaigns in the 530 that dragged on for nearly 20 years and left Italy more devastated than either Alaric or Genseric ever had. Even that reconquest didn't last. Within a few decades, the Lombards swept into Italy and carved out their own kingdom on much of the same ground. Rome, as a single governed territory, was gone for good, no matter how many armies from the east tried to stitch it back together. And the world Odoacer built afterward didn't collapse into chaos the way later imagination likes to picture it. Italy kept its Senate. Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman landholding patterns largely continued under Odoacer's rule, and later under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who took Italy from Odoacer in 493. What changed wasn't everything overnight. What changed was the idea that a single unbroken imperial line, running back to Augustus, still governed the Western Mediterranean. That idea, more than any army or invasion, is what actually ended in 476. You can still feel the aftershocks of that year today. The political map of Western Europe, with its patchwork of kingdoms rather than one unified empire, traces its roots to exactly this transition, Germanic kingdoms rising on former Roman soil while claiming, in various ways, to be Rome's true heirs. The very language you use to describe governments, senates, republics, the word emperor itself, comes down through the memory of what Rome was before this moment and what it became after. Even the argument over when Rome really fell says something about how much that empire still shapes how we think about power, decline, and how civilizations end, not always with fire, but sometimes with a quiet pension and a villa by the sea. It's the last morning an emperor will ever rule from Ravenna, and you're the one still standing there, watching a boy named for Rome's founder walk out of history without a single sword being raised in his defense.